Hey, what's up everybody, this is Muth24, and today I'm going to be doing another graphic novel review. This is for the first two volumes of the graphic novel Saga, which is written by Brian K. Vaughan, the same author of the Y the Last Man series, which I previously did a review of that entire series in different parts. Like I've mentioned before, I don't read a ton of comic books or graphic novels, and most of the ones I'm familiar with are the Spider-Man storylines, the Batman, X-Men, Watchmen, and then of course Y the Last Man. So, admittedly, my familiarity with a lot of the old school comic books, and even some of the more new school ones where they're breaking away from superhero stuff like Walking Dead, I'm really not as familiar with the comic book adaptations of those. But I have to say, I really enjoy Y the Last Man. It's probably the favorite of all the graphic novels that I've read so far, and so I thought, I'll give Saga a shot. I went into it knowing very little about it, other than it was much more grandiose a scale than Y the Last Man. Y the Last Man was very much a self-contained story about the world after a fallout where, all the men died, and it followed Yorick Brown for the most part. And there were different snippets that you'd see from other people and how the world had affected them, but it was very much Yorick's story and all the people that he tagged along with, or the people who were invested in him in some way or another. Saga is a much less one-track series, if you will. Marco and Alana, the two main characters you see here, are a couple who come from two different species that have been at war with each other for a long time, and they sort of fall into this non-conventional Romeo and Juliet sort of a scenario where they end up falling in love with each other and give birth to a child who presumably inherits traits of both parents, even though they're from different species, and it threatens to upset the status quo, if you will, because these two species have been at war for so long that it's just pretty much a given that you're taught from an early age that you are supposed to hate the enemy. You're not supposed to question it. You're supposed to know that you're supposed to hate them, and if you enlist in the military, you're going to spend your days hunting them down across the galaxy. So Marco's alien race is very much humanoid. Obviously, you can see he has sort of like ram-like horns and sort of goat ears there, but other than that, it's very humanoid, very familiar. Same goes for Alana. Her species are more or less human, except for the fact that they have wings on their back. So in the case of Alana, she has very sort of insect-like wings, almost like a grasshopper or something there. Some of the other people of her species have more feathered bird-like wings, bat wings, etc., etc. And while we don't see a lot of the baby outside of being, swaddled in cloth there, we do see that there are little marks on her head where horns would presumably eventually come out of, and so I think we can pretty much gather that she'll have wings at some point too. The story is interesting in the sense that it is actually being told from the future. It's actually being told by their daughter, who is, presumably an adult by the time she's having these, flashbacks to the past. But her narration is actually shown in, scribbled text, if you will. I can flip through here a second and find a good example of that. Whereas the dialogue that's actually happening, at the time is still in normal text bubbles. So here's a good example of it. You see where it says he just couldn't say no to her. That's the daughter telling the story from the future, whereas the regular text bubbles are still what's happening at the present time of the story. So it does very much start off with a bang. Alana and Marco are on the run. She's giving birth, actually, as the story starts, and they've paid off some guy to let them use their warehouse for the evening to let her give birth, because they know going to hospitals just going to make them that much easier to target. And there are people basically closing in on them. The two different sides use very much different weapons in their fight against one another. And so Alana's people are more technological, more militaristic. They have very standardized weapons and ranks and armor and all that. Whereas Marco's people are more reliant on old world magic. Some of them use staffs. He has an enchanted sword. And they use different spells and stuff to raise barriers, heal one another, hold stuff together that's falling apart, etc. So Alana and Marco are very much the pillar that holds the series together, as is the daughter. And her name's Hazel. But there's a lot of other characters that we see the story presented through, and sort of how they're invested in it. Because as soon as word gets out that two aliens of different races that have been at war with each other for so long are having a baby together, or have had a child together, there's a bunch of different mercenary groups that get hired by the two different armies, as well as like sort of individual groups who are invested in this for political reasons more than anything else. Most of the people want them just, wiped out so that they don't have to have this spring up as a potential upset to the war already, and sort of not to give the other side ideas that, oh, maybe we can come to some sort of agreement, because there are other individuals invested in this war who are still gaining from it, whether it's monetary gain or status gain or whatever. The fact that there's still a war going on gives them something to draw out of all this chaos. So to that end, I don't think that the plot is nearly as deep, at least not yet, as Why the Last Man, but it's also a very different story. Like I said, Why the Last Man was about Yorick and about the world after all the men died, whereas this is sort of more a Guardians of the Galaxy type Star Wars setting, where, yes, it's about Alana and Marco, but they're doing as much here to talk about those characters and their story as they are to present very outlandish and bizarre settings and scenarios, where you have this place called the Rocket Ship Forest, where there is literally a tree that is a giant rocket ship that, because it's made of wood, will go undetected by your typical radar setups and all that. Obviously, you have the different species. These ones are very humanoid. There are some that are just completely weird. Like, there's this character named the Stalk, who is basically a human torso, but she has no arms on the upper part of the torso. She has 8 eyes, and then she has a bunch of long, spindly, crooked arms underneath her dress that are like spider arms. There's some other aliens that you just kind of see briefly in the background that just look super weird and very different, and it's kind of cool in that sense that in the Star Wars convention that it's like, just going to throw these in the background, not have to explain them, but it's like, yeah, hey, there's some other aliens that you can see. You can see more of this world just through these little snippets in the background. So I think the story's done pretty well to keep itself at a pretty consistent pace so far. Like I said, I don't think it's quite as good as Y, at least not yet. But that said, Y did have its high points and its low points throughout. So I felt like it's been pretty consistent quality-wise so far, which is good. These are only the first 2 trade backs, and I believe they cover like 11 or so volumes in total. 12. Yep, it's actually 12 volumes of the original comic book print. As with Y, there are some very adult themes going on here, and I think even more so to some degree in these than there were in Y. There was always the theme of socio-political fallout in Y the Last Man, whereas here it's sort of to try and sustain it. These people who are attempting to capture or murder Alana and Marco are hoping to maintain the status quo, but they're still very violent in the nature they do things. There's a guy named The Will who is, I believe, is a human, uses his pet cat named Lying Cat, who can tell when people are lying or telling the truth. And he's incredibly violent with the way that he reacts to certain people not giving him what he wants, or just, if he's cornered, has to fight, he will do things like, he just literally smashes one guy's brains in with his hands. And I think that's more a testament of how just strong he is, as opposed to how weak the other alien was, because he's a pretty big guy. There's also a lot more in the way of sexuality in these comics, especially explicit sexuality, whereas Y the Last Man, they kind of poked fun at Yorick being not the most masculine character in the series, and it was kind of a running gag throughout the series. And they also had the idea that because there are no men left, there were some women who would just turn to lesbianism because there's no guys around. Whereas with this, it's not really any of the main characters that you see engaging in sexual acts. They have one flashback to when Alana and Marco were getting pretty hot and heavy, and before Hazel was around. But there's one part where they go to like a red light district on one of the planets, and it's just a bunch of images just kind of presented in a row there. So to that end, I think it's It overdoes it a little bit, especially in that first volume. Though it does seem to be late in Volume 1 and especially into Volume 2 that there are some long-term ramifications of some of these different characters engaging with one another in that way. Most notably being Thor. He's a robot prince, or a robot. I believe he's a prince, or he's engaged to the princess. That's what it is. So that, like, the fact that she's carrying a child, now there's some stakes at risk for him with regards to how seriously he takes his job. But beyond that, a lot of it just kind of seems like it's there to give you a better idea of what some of these planets and some of these people do outside of the main story. It's not like bothersome necessarily. It's just I don't really see the point of some of it. It just kind of seems like it's there to sell it a little bit more. So when I mentioned with Y the Last Man, I really enjoyed the art pieces for the individual covers, but the art style overall was just it was pretty good. It wasn't anything outstanding, I didn't think, but I thought it was decent. I really love the art style of Saga. Fiona Staples has done a really good job illustrating the characters and the settings and, you know, acts of combat and all that. I'll flip through the volumes just because, as I mentioned, there's some more graphic content in here that I don't really want to show on the cover necessarily, or on the video, sorry, necessarily. But yeah, he got a good idea of how the different armies sort of carry out their attacks and such. There's a technology versus magic. Here is a shot of just some of like the landscapes that they're going to go by. Got some really nice coloring there. Lots of action going on down below. And then here's some of the individual cover art. There we have the Will and Lion Cat. And let's see if I can find one more here. This one is actually right before they find the rocket ship forest. It's a bunch of leaves with water droplets right outside a planet there. So most of the cover volumes are pretty simplistic, but they're very nicely detailed. This one's actually my favorite. It's on the back here. Kind of got a overview of all the stuff that's prominent in the first volume there. But yeah, I have enjoyed this series quite a bit. Like I said, I don't think it's quite as good as Y, but it's also a very different story than Y was. I really like the art style. I really like Marco and Alana's characters. They're very funny in the way that they interact with each other, because Alana is more of a no-nonsense soldier type who was always raised in that style, and Marco was born into, obviously, a wartime scenario, though a lot of the conflicts they state had actually moved away from the planet that he was born on into other areas of space. But he's actually kind of a rebel in the sense that he's been born into this family who's long served in the military and long had, you know, ties to the mythos and magic of their race, but he doesn't buy into it anymore. He believes that, you know, there's another way we can do things, that we don't have to keep fighting forever, that, you know, peace and conversation can sometimes lead to a better outcome than what has been perpetuating for so many years beforehand. And it's really funny because not only are they from different races, but they have very different outlooks on the world. And even though they've been in love for a while before the series picks up, before that first volume starts off, it's pretty clear that they very much do things differently, and they are sort of learning as they go how to not only be parents, but also get along with one another and sort of understand where each other's coming from. So to that end, I think they're probably the most entertaining part of the entire series, just their interactions. Some of Hazel's quips about how her parents behaved when she was younger are hilarious, because we can assume that she's probably a young adult, if not quite a ways into adulthood, by the time she's, you know, flashing back and recalling all these events. So it was really funny just to hear how she's taking to those scenarios in the future, and how she realizes how dumb her parents were in certain scenarios, and how dumb other people were in scenarios, and then also how clever people were in certain scenarios. So that's just a really cool part, I thought. But yeah, I think if you're into the really strange cosmic type comic books, like I said, Guardians of the Galaxy, or even your Star Wars type stories, I think you'll enjoy these as far as how they present the world and present the different planets they're visiting and the different races and all that. The story is pretty simplistic so far, but I do like the fact that we're getting more and more of these other side characters as we go. Marco and Alana are pretty much the main focus of the first volume, but later in the first volume we get Thor, and we get the Will, and we get the Stalk, and all these other characters who are going to be important later on, presumably. So it's nice to see that they're doing their best to balance that out as much as I can early on. So that's pretty much it for this review, and with that, I will see you guys next time.